It was here, in this sparsely populated forest in the south of Washington, D.C., that 6 Nazi spies were buried in the summer of 1942, forgotten to history for more than 70 years. The truth about this chapter in American history is finally being revealed. The torrid spectacle of how these saboteurs came to be executed and buried in the nation's capital is a story of wartime justice, public hysteria, and a legal decision that would change the course of American history.
Today's threat to our national security is not a matter of military weapons alone. We know of new methods of attack. The Trojan horse, the fifth column that betrays a nation unprepared for treachery. Spies, saboteurs, and traitors are the actors in this new strategy. These dividing forces are undiluted poison. They must not be allowed to spread in the new world as they have in the old.
As Hitler's army swept through Europe, he knew a titan was lurking across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States was now in the war and threatened to crush the German war machine under the weight of America's massive industrial might.
Only in plants like these could such a gigantic job of production be achieved overnight. This is industrial America at war. The arsenal of democracy delivering the goods.
Something had to be done to slow the ever-increasing pace of manufacturing in North America. President Roosevelt had announced bold plans to expand production of wartime material to levels unheard of in the history of humanity.
Where automobile fenders once were made, aircraft propellers are turned out by the thousands. Where watch cases and compacts once were made, now shell cases by the millions. Assembly lines of machine guns moving to war on the same conveyors that only yesterday carried American typewriters.
Aluminum production would increase from 300,000 pounds in 1937 to 1.2 million pounds by the end of 1942. Aircraft production would more than double in 1 year to 125,000 planes, each of which had to move along America's vast rail network between the industrial heartland and ports along the Atlantic Ocean for shipment to the front line. Hitler and his generals approved a bold plan drawn up by German intelligence to recruit operatives in Germany who had either lived in America or were American citizens to sabotage factories, railways, and bridges across the heartland. Following months of explosives training, these saboteurs, outfitted with weaponry, cash, and forged U.S. government documents, would embark on 2 U-boats and land in the United States. One group would land on the shores of Long Island in Amagansett, while the other in Ponte Verde in northern Florida. From there, they would destroy targets in Kentucky, Illinois, Tennessee, Niagara Falls, and most importantly, the Horseshoe Curve Railroad Pass in Pennsylvania, which provided a critical link between factories in the center of the country with ports on the East Coast. Operation Pastorius began with the departure of U-202 from Lorient, France on March 26, 1942. Slipping across the Atlantic Ocean through the light American defenses, the teams landed 1 week apart. The first team, led by American George Dash, landed here along a sparsely populated stretch of Long Island. As the men and their supplies slipped onto the beach, they were spotted by an unarmed Coast Guardsman named John Cullen. The Germans claimed to be fishermen. A suspicious Cullen demanded the men return with him to the Coast Guard watch station. Dash attempted to bribe Cullen into silence and then threatened to kill him if he didn't leave. A thick fog obscured the U-boat just 200 yards offshore. Cullen fled into the fog to report what he was now sure were Germans on the beach. The 4 Germans hastily buried their explosives in the sand and fled away from the beach, knowing that more patrols would be coming. Dash and his men headed straight for the train station, where they boarded the Long Island Railroad for Penn Station in downtown Manhattan. They split up into 2 groups and booked hotels in different parts of town to avoid suspicion. Unbeknownst to co-conspirators Richard Quirin and Heinrich Heink, George Dash and Ernst Berger had a treacherous reason for choosing to partner off upon arrival in New York. Wartime Germany was a Spartan nation, where even the most basic necessities were difficult to come by. All of the men on the mission were either American citizens or had lived in the United States for long periods of their lives. They were elated to be back in a land of plenty and took full advantage. Night after night, they enjoyed fine dining, late nights in taverns, and returned to some of the best hotels in the city. Dash and Berger stayed here at the Governor Clinton. It was the first time the two had been alone together since the mission began. Within only a few days, they confessed to each other that neither had any intention of following through with Hitler's mission and planned to expose the plot to the FBI. Their suspicions of each other were confirmed. They agreed that Dash would take a train to Washington, D.C. to turn himself in to the FBI, while Berger remained in New York to reassure the other plotters. The second group was on its way from Florida to Chicago and New York, utterly unaware that they were about to be the subjects of a nationwide manhunt. For the next 6 days, George Dash arrived each morning at the Department of Justice building to be questioned by FBI Special Agent Dwayne Traynor. The agency decided they were more likely to get the most information out of Dash if they allowed him to indulge the delusion that he was a free man and voluntarily cooperating. The strategy worked. Dash eventually gave them the entire plan, from recruitment in Germany, the landings on the beaches up to his trip from New York to D.C. One by one, the other spies and their accomplices in America were placed under surveillance and arrested.
Mr. J. Edgar Hoover and his G-men have a tremendous job watching nearly 5,000 miles of coast for enemy sneak invaders. These official American pictures show how cases of explosives and other means of sabotage from Germany were found buried in the Florida sands by 8 Nazi spies. Captured equipment included uniforms for the spies after landing, a money belt containing $170,000 American to finance deeds of destruction.
With all 8 spies now in custody, the ever-image-conscious FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover knew it was only a matter of time before news of the capture got out. Enraging the Secretary of War and the Chief of the Coast Guard, both heads of agencies that played a critical role in the investigation and capture of the saboteurs, Hoover held a press conference in which he announced the arrest of the Germans and took full credit for himself and the FBI.
The recent landing of saboteurs from Nazi submarines sounded a new alert for all Americans. They were apprehended before they could carry out their plans of destruction.
President Roosevelt had no appetite for a lengthy trial in federal courts or even a military court-martial. For the first time in 70 years, a military commission was convened under an executive order from the president. With much lower standards for evidence and conviction, Roosevelt saw such an arrangement as a way to fast-track the execution of the men while still providing some pretense of due process.
The 8 German spies who landed secretly in America from U-boats are brought to trial at Washington before a military court.
In private, there was never any doubt in the president's mind that he would order most of the men to be executed. The only question was whether or not he would commute the death sentence for Dash and Berger to life in prison for their cooperation. In a surprise move by the defense lawyers Roosevelt himself had appointed to defend the Germans, they appealed to the Supreme Court with a writ of habeas corpus, claiming the men were unjustly detained and had a right to a trial in a civilian court. They further argued that the military tribunal itself was unconstitutional. With some Supreme Court justices indifferent to the rights of the enemy during war, and others unwilling to challenge the power of the executive branch in the face of an existential threat, the justices did something unprecedented. They issued a verdict upholding the constitutionality of the military commission in trying the saboteurs, but provided no written opinion justifying their ruling. This opinion would only come months after the Germans had met their fate and would be used in 2001 by the Bush administration to provide a legal basis for holding terrorists at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. On August 8, 1942, 6 Nazi spies were executed in an electric chair at the D.C. jailhouse. Their bodies were quietly buried in unmarked graves in a potter's field at the southern tip of Washington, D.C. It was of the utmost importance to President Roosevelt that no one know where the Nazis were buried. He feared the site becoming a morbid spectacle to which Nazi sympathizers would make pilgrimages. The president's concerns were not unfounded and would be realized decades later when electrical workers made a shocking discovery in a field at the southern tip of Washington, D.C. In 2006, while clearing a field of high grass to prevent a possible fire from nearby electrical lines, a crew discovered a grave marker with 6 names on it: Herbie Haupt, Heinrich Heinck, Edward Curling, Hermann Neubauer, Richard Quirin, and Warner Thiel, the 6 Nazi saboteurs who had been executed nearly 65 years earlier. Ominously carved at the bottom was the phrase, "Donated by the NSWPP," more commonly known as the American Nazi Party. Authorities believe the stone was placed in this field sometime in the early 1960s. A cross-reference of government documents and burial records would later reveal that the stone was placed just 200 yards from the actual burial site. But how could they have known where to put the stone? Had Nazis staked out the army facility where the bodies were stored after the execution? Was there a member of the U.S. Army burial team who had leaked the location? The mystery of the Nazi grave marker is likely to remain unsolved. The Nazi saboteurs remain buried in Washington, D.C. among hundreds of other bodies in a mass grave used for nearly 100 years to dispose of unidentified Americans.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.